You want me to start?
Yes.
Okay.
This is Words Aptly Spoken, which comes from Proverbs 25:11. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. The written word is a precious treasure. We want to preserve written knowledge for God's glory and as an anchor to the history of the church and its classical conversations. We hope to encourage the reading of words and of the word.
Welcome to Speare. Jennifer Courtney and I discuss a book each week from the Classical Conversations curated curriculum with you. This is a book club for lovers of the Word made flesh. It is Thursday, March 9th, 2023, and I'm Lee Bordens. You guys able to hear me? I just had a blip go across. Okay, this month's book club highlights resources for learning more about grammar and language. We're taking a break from the theme of grammar though tonight in honor of Easter. I know it's not Easter yet, but we wanted to get this recorded ahead of time. We'll be discussing The Bronze Bow by Elizabeth George Speare, an amazing Easter read for your family. But we're going to finish up the month with The War Against Grammar, a difficult book, but we're going to jump in there, and Teaching the Classics, a really easy book. If you missed any of our previous episodes, you can find them on Lee Borton's YouTube channel. I also host 2 other book clubs, and I invite you to participate in them. One's right after this with Kevin Novak called Unfragmented, where we talk about just current events and things of cohesive living as Christians. And then Monday nights, we have the Math Map with Kirsty Gilpin. Okay, so now I'm bringing in our co-host, Jennifer. It's time for our word word. Jennifer, what's the word for this week?
Well, we are taking a break again from Latin. So we had a Greek word. This week, we're going to have an Old English word, which is whiffery, which word I actually got from you, Lee.
Yes.
When you texted me the other day, I started thinking about this word. So we have the word husbandry, which we still use in English. That has to do with tending crops and animals. And it comes from the 2 Old Norse words, which mean house and tiller of the soil. But we don't so much use the word whiffery. In fact, Tim and I were talking today about the fact that we still use midwifery, but that's sort of a subcategory of whiffery itself. And that word in the Old English, it's just the Old English word for woman, but it came to mean the care of home and children. So the word for husband meant outdoors, land and crops, and the word wife came to be associated with the care of home and children. So everyone had their domain to care for. And I love, as you guys know, I love the study of the history of words, and most of our multi-syllable abstract words come from Latin and Greek, but most of our simple everyday words in English, like husband and wife, come from Old English or Old Norse. So that's kind of a cool thought too, that these common everyday words come straight from the Old or Middle English. So I was wondering,
okay.
Oh yeah, go ahead. I was just going to ask what brought it up for you, Lee.
Yeah. So I'm a little concerned about my sound. I'm doing okay though.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
okay,
we can
good.
hear you.
Yeah.
Yes. So I was thinking about animal husbandry. We own a farm and we're looking at working with a farmer to do some lambing and some orchards and vineyards and crops and that kind of thing. And, I was researching animal husbandry came up, and within the Reform movement right now, which I belong to a Reformed church, there's a lot of discussion about women reclaiming their proper role, which is not to beat up men, but to actually be partners with them. And so the word whiffery and wives is just being used a lot in my church. And so when I saw that animal husbandry, I thought, well, if it's a woman farmer, why would it not be animal whiffery? So that's where it came up for me. So I went online and looked, and there's lots of blogs now that are using that word, and there's lots of blogs about farm wife. And I was thinking the farmer's wife, the farm wife, different words like that, or blogs like that. I think people are proud of being wives, and our culture probably for the last 40 years has made it so that being proud of your whiffery skills is not something to brag about. So I thought it'd be interesting to bring the word back.
Yeah, one of the books that we read from Anthony Esselin talked a lot about his idea that his grandmother was one of the most free women he knew because she had her domain and it was able to freely exercise her talents within her domain. whether she was painting something from her garden or making home remedies. I've just always thought that was an interesting idea that he had. So
Yeah. Tim had a comment about the word.
Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, when I was in college, I got a part-time job working at the National Soil Tilth Laboratory. I had no idea what tilth was until I started working there. But that's also an old English word that has to do with, right, the tilling of the soil, but it's the condition of having been tilled.
interesting.
Well, I'll just leave it to me to take it, down another path. There is a new show coming called The Farmer's Looking for a Wife.
I saw that.
It's like The Bachelor for farmers. So I wonder if they'll have whiffery skills that they highlight there. Probably not.
I don't know, but I think it's a word that we should try to figure out how to use or
I
bring
love
back.
it. Mm-hmm.
So, anyway,
Yeah.
well, speaking of words, I also want to share, I have some words kindly spoken today to share with you guys.
Good.
I was in Kansas recently, and I'm learning how to use Zoom with the background. If I pull it up right in front of me, I don't wiggle. Anyway, there's a sticker from Kansas they gave to me. And what I was there on tour, and they gave us a Bible verse. And no surprise, he has made everything beautiful in its time. Ecclesiastes 3:11. And with spring coming, everything just seems so much more beautiful. This morning when I woke up, I'm reminded by in the spring here in North Carolina, it reminds me of when I was in South Africa on safari, because like I get up and it's warm and the stars are so bright, and we have bunnies in the front yard and a fox on the backyard and deer under the pear tree, and the birds are going crazy, and everything's just so beautiful in the spring. So I appreciate the card that they gave me to remind me of that. So thanks, Kansas. All right.
That's lovely.
It is. Okay, so it looks like everybody's got their screens turned on already. We're very excited about the bronze bow, and I can't wait to discuss it with you guys. It's a book where I almost want to read the last line first because it's so beautiful, the memories I have of reading it with my children and then myself a few times. But Jennifer, tell us about reading the bronze bow with your children.
Well, I'll talk about the first time I read it with children, which was with my son, Ben. And I had a lot of little ones at the time. And so we were sitting down in the evening to have a conversation about it with just the two of us. And we were trying to figure out what he was going to write about. And he decided to write about leadership and what it means to give yourself over to following someone. And there were some great food for thought in this book, because you have this contrast of Rosh, who is the leader of the zealot armies, and then you have the boy Daniel meeting Jesus, who is a very different kind of leader. And so we were able to make this wonderful comparison chart on our whiteboard about those different leadership styles and which one would you follow and why, and how do you know you've chosen a good leader to follow. And that was the first time I remember having a really, really rich, thoughtful conversation with him. So
Yeah, the book inspires that in a lot of different ways. So are there more you said about Ben, or do you have another story too?
Well, part of that conversation I was thinking about it, just the idea that we talk about the theme of Challenge B, and this book goes so well with it, which is that ownership builds discipline, because Daniel is young and is forced to take ownership of his life and start making these choices. And so that just is precious to me, as they're at this age where our own kids are just starting to take ownership. This gives them a great model of that.
Yeah, we call them coming of age stories for a reason. It's, to me, a coming of age story is when a young person has to behave in an adult situation, but he or she is not abandoned. There is support and usually family in the stories around them. And a coming of age story should always end in hope, which I think all the books and classical conversations do that we read with the children. So let's just kind of set up what's going on first before we talk about the title and some of the key verses. You mentioned Daniel. Who's Daniel?
Yeah, so he's a young boy. This book is set in the Holy Land. So we have books from various historical periods. They're sprinkled throughout the classical conversations curriculum. And this particular one is historical fiction set at the time of the coming of the Messiah. So Daniel is a young man his parents die, and he and his sister are raised by their grandmother. In fact, Daniel's father is killed by the Romans, which is an important part of the story. And Daniel is sold into an apprenticeship by his grandmother and breaks free from that. And that's when he joins the band of zealots out in the hills before he returns to the city of Jerusalem.
Yes. So his sister is Leah, and Leah's pretty traumatized by the things that she's seen. Something that, like, again, I like about this kind of book is the children, if they're in church, have a context for Easter and for crucifixions. And Daniel's father, that's how he was killed, actually. He was crucified, and his sister Leah saw it. So it's a story that speaks to not just the message they hear in church, but they read this book about two children who actually, even though this is fictionalized, it was actually part of their daily existence to see Romans and to see crucifixions. So it doesn't hold back, but it doesn't say a lot about them either. It's just, it's not gruesome in any way. All right, so there's some other characters. Well, actually, before we do characters, you remind me of something. When you're telling the story, there's 5 things, right? Setting, character.
Oh, yeah. Plot,
conflict, and its resolution.
Theme.
Yeah. So let's go over those with this book, The Bronze Bow. So the setting you just told us about. So let's review who the characters are. And then if anybody would like to, after we go through the characters, to express a love or a joy of one of them, tell us why you love that character or why you thought they were just a good example of maybe historical accuracy, or just something about a character that you enjoyed. There's some really nice people in here, and there's some really mean people in here.
Yeah, as it turns out, Rosh, the leader of the zealots, is not super kind to his followers. He uses them.
So you had that family, but the family's in absentia, a lot of it, right? The grandmother is referred to a few times, but the mom and dad are dead, and so really it's the brother, sister. Then Rosh, and who else?
There's Joel, and I think he's about this. Is he older than Daniel? I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, he's around the same age, but Joel has a sister, which is important.
Malthace, yep.
And why is she important? Do you remember?
I can't remember. Oh my goodness.
Well, so Leah's traumatized, but Malthace is really kind to Leah. And Daniel, you get this inkling that he's probably going to marry her. He's starting to fall in love with
that's
Malthace.
right.
Yeah, but they're all very young. So, but of course, people got married a lot younger back then too. But he's not ready to marry anybody, is he? Because they're still very, very poor.
Yes.
And there's a lot of stuff going on. And now he has a sister to take care of. So do any of you, remember what was with Leah? Like, she's a key person throughout it.
She's demon possessed, isn't she? Or they think she is? Or is it just trauma? I thought it was demon possession.
Well, and in that day and age, like, would we say someone was demon possessed now that was traumatized? Should we? Shouldn't we? What do you guys think? I don't know, Tim, are people demon possessed when they're traumatized?
I think it could be possible, but it's probably presumptuous to say that they are.
Okay. Yeah, it's possible. We don't go around talking that way today, do we? We say they're mentally ill or they have PTSD, but all sins from the author of sin.
It is interesting.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, for just a second, it reminded me of some of the conversations in Augustine's City of God when he's talking about, the Christian women who are raped by the Roman soldiers and just how to care for them. So he doesn't use the same words we would use for that trauma, but it's the same thing here. There is this burgeoning sense of compassion among the Christians for these situations and for the care of people. So.
Yeah, there's a scene where people are so afraid of Leah that they throw bread into the window so they don't have to see her or touch her. And Daniel has to deal with his sister like that. So no wonder he's so angry.
Mhm.
So what's the conflict? Kind of alluded, we're headed that way.
Yeah, so I think this it feels like a man versus man conflict, right? The Rosh is ready to avenge the Jewish people and attack the Romans and bring about the kingdom of God on earth in his own hands and in his own ways.
Yeah, so it reminds me, the book reminds us that it's kind of like what the apostles, some of the zealot apostles were looking for in Jesus, and he just wasn't that way. So Rosh is almost like someone, I see him as what they had kind of hoped the Messiah would be like. And of course, we just know that he's a young person who's a revolutionary. And as you know, he might seem wholehearted to Daniel at first, but over time he learns that no, he's just using them. He just wants power and wealth,
Yeah.
like anybody else in that situation. So,
Yeah.
okay, so you said man against man. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say Rosh doesn't end up being it's Joel, right, who's imprisoned, and then Rosh just doesn't have any time to deal with that. It's just he's just a casualty of the war. And
yeah, which Daniel gets to then see that his best friend is that casualty, and maybe Rosh isn't all that he said that he is. So you said the conflict's man against man. Does anybody else want to? I don't know. Tim or Jen or anybody else that's on. Have you read the book recently? Do you remember? Are there other conflicts?
I think there's a really interesting conflict as Daniel wrestles with choosing who he's going to follow, partly because of who he's going to follow, but also because of the situation with Samson, right? As they rescue this slave who seems to maybe have diminished capacity, or at least doesn't speak the language and doesn't seem to know what's going on, but he kind of looks up to Daniel. And so Daniel is pressed into the role of being a leader of another sort, at the same time that he's still wrestling with leading within his family and choosing who he's going to follow.
Yeah. And Samson's someone we appreciate by the end of the book too. We're sympathetic with him. What about what are other major themes of conflict, Jennifer, besides man versus man?
So, and I was just about to say another one that you could argue is in this book is man versus self, because Daniel is at war with himself. He has to overcome his desire to get revenge for his father's death. And he has to take the responsibility of the care for his sister and become the man of that family. And he is also at war with himself as he's deciding who he's going to become. And that's a pretty common conflict. Sometimes you have war against, you have man versus nature, where nature is actually the most hostile thing that the hero is fighting against. And then sometimes it's man versus God, or man versus the gods, lowercase g. So those are kind of the common ones.
So I can't think of anything that's really man versus nature, but man against God, that's a big theme here. Right? That wrestling with Jesus.
Yeah.
Well, and it's justice too, I think. Having a cause. I know my boys, that's one of the things, now that remembering Elijah reading it, from a boy's perspective, he couldn't he understood, you have to get to that point he felt like he abandoned his grandmother, by fighting this thing. So, he's fighting himself, but also there's a justice that, well, God is just, and so, when is the time to be just and when is the time to be mercy and empathy, all of that. So.
Yeah, so there's a lot of conflict.
And that's that conflict between justice and mercy comes up a lot in the man versus God conflicts, where the person they think they want justice or they think they want mercy, and they can't understand what God is actually doing and why mercy is better. So that that conflict comes up often. I was thinking about that because Mia and I just read The Cop and the Anthem this morning, and I was thinking there again, you see that echo of justice and mercy, because the anthem is someone playing a hymn on the organ. So you have this grace that this homeless man can move toward, or he can put his hands in the justice system. And so you see that theme so often everywhere.
So justice. Yeah. And it's hard as an adult to be frustrated in an unjust system. And so we get to see this from a child's perspective. It just, to me, opened up a lot of conversation about when our own children were frustrated, to remember that there actually is redemption at the end. And sometimes you just have to live through some things and always wake up and do what's in front of you. And that's building that discipleship. Okay, so did we do them all? So Julie touched it on themes, justice. We talked about conflict. We talked about setting.
Plot is the only other thing, and we've just sort of been weaving around through some of the major events in the plot. So the death of Daniel's father, then Daniel breaking away from his apprenticeship, and we've touched on the plot with Leah. We've touched on them rescuing Samson, Joel being in prison. So those are all elements of that plot arc.
Right. Okay, so let's start. So now that we actually had a little conversation on teaching literature, let's go back to the bronze bow as far as the details within it. So Jennifer, why is it called the bronze bow?
Yeah, so that comes straight from 2 Samuel 22, which is David's song of praise after he's delivered from the hand of Saul, which seems fitting for a book that's about a struggle to be free from those who rule over us. And so in that psalm, David says, "He trains my hands for battle. My arms can bend a bow of bronze." And that's the NIV translation that she took this title from. But I've loved discussing the title with my kids because, as we've discussed, Daniel wants to bend the bow of bronze and fight. And instead, he sees Jesus, who's teaching a very different way of battle from that of Rosh. So
do you think when it says bend the bow of bronze, that you're talking about it's just a bronze bow and you're bending the string? Or is it something about the strength of pulling that string that you're strong enough to bend the bronze itself? What does that even mean?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I sort of translated that word bend in my mind as wield, that I can wield the bow of bronze. So maybe that's not right though.
Yeah, because when you're hunting, it's just difficult because you can't pull the string back because of the strength of the bow itself is causing a problem. The other thing is because it's bronze. I mean, I don't know. I've only had a fiberglass bow in my hand. I don't know what bronze would feel like. I'm going to guess it's heavy too.
I would think.
I don't know. And so you get that strength, and we'll find out through the end of the book, and that's the part that makes it hopeful because the Lord's going to give you that. The Lord gives Daniel that strength. And I don't want to ruin the ending. And so I just really encourage you to read it. Okay, so before we go on, let me thank our sponsor, classicalconversationbooks.com, where the books discussed can be purchased. And we have the entire 2023 Words Aptly Spoken books at my site, leebortons.com, with links to CC Book site, so you can just purchase them very easily. Next week's book club on Thursday, March 16th, we're going to discuss David Mulroy's book, The War Against Grammar. That one's going to be pretty heady, so you might want to look at it either online or buy it if you can before we get to the discussion. And now I want to know, Jennifer, so we just have Lisa's joined us. Lisa, do you have any questions or comments about the bronze bow? Or are you just here to listen?
I'm just here to listen for the first time.
Oh, nice. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, welcome. I was just going to circle back, Lee, to that. We talked about the parts of the story sequence chart as one way to enter the story. And so then we discussed amongst ourselves the meaning of the title. And I always think that's a great thing to do at the end of the book. It often provides a way to discuss the entirety of the book, to go back to the title that the author gave it and see and unravel the meaning of the story that way. So I always like to do that with my kids when we have finished reading it, go back to the title and see why, what it means, like Number the Stars and A Door in the Wall we talked about on earlier book clubs. Those are very meaningful titles that give you a clue to the whole meaning of the book.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting how the fictional writers, generally the title's not obvious until you read it. It's like you have to read it to know what they meant. Good.
I
Got a thought.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned that should go at the end, because that's where we put it in our writing, right? We write the paper first, and then we give it a title. And I think it makes sense to put it there at the end of our discussion too, because otherwise we're asking our students to just speculate out of ignorance about the title. And that's not a very helpful way to have a good conversation.
Yeah. Well, and that's like when, you give children a title or a topic to write about, and it almost seems unfair. Like, it's like you write better if you write what you want to write about, then title it. But, we're trying to learn how to write with prompts and write in community. So you need to all start at the same place and hopefully end up somewhere similar. Okay, so Jennifer, you were going to read some of this to us to discuss. Before you do that, though, the author is Elizabeth George Speare. Can you tell us some of the other books she wrote?
She did The Witch of Blackbird Pond, which we also read in Challenge 1, which is one of my favorites.
Okay. Tell us, why is that one of your favorites? Because we probably won't ever have a whole club on that book.
I was so charmed reading it when I was younger, because it's about a young orphan who has been raised in the Caribbean, and she is sent to a Puritan village to live with her relatives after the death of her parents. And so she's thrust into a very, very different culture. And then one of the first friends she makes is this outsider to the community who is actually a Quaker woman. So you've got this intersection of all of these cultures. And again, it's a story about this young woman, Kit, trying to figure out who she is and how she can join this community and accept her role within that community. And that's a great thought for our kids. When I was little, I think I was simply charmed by the woman they call the Witch of Blackbird Pond, Hannah, because she's just a fascinating character. And I was always so eager for Kit to slip out to her house and see what new things she could learn from Hannah.
Yeah. Okay, so that's something that's in common with our current book, is it's about a young person who was having to deal with all kinds of different cultures, right? And Daniel's doing that too in The Bronze Bow. Yeah. The other book she wrote that we read is The Sign of the Beaver.
That's right.
One of my favorites, because it's about a dad who left his children in the woods for a few months to go find a wife, which is kind of reminiscent of what Abraham Lincoln's dad did. He left Abraham and Sarah in the woods for a few months while he went to find a wife. Then meanwhile, this young man has to figure out some way to get back to his dad as the time goes on too long. And I just think about the responsibility that children were able to handle. I mean, we would say that was child abuse now.
Yeah.
But a 12, 13-year-old was considered able to take care of themselves because they probably could.
Yeah. He does get some help from the Beaver tribe, which is a fun part of this story. But that was probably Ben's favorite read aloud, because I think he longed to have that kind of responsibility given to him. That was one of the deep longings of his heart, even at that age of 12 and 13.
Yeah, let me be a man.
Mm-hmm.
Let me be a woman.
Mm-hmm.
We know we're headed that way, and we're struggling with childhood at that time. So you had a Quaker in The Witch of Blackbird Pond, and you had the Beaver tribe, Indians coming from out. Who's that parallel in the Bronze Bow, do you think?
I hadn't thought about that. Do you have a thought, Tim? Do you mean in the sense of the person who takes him under their wing or gives him skills?
Yeah, I think there was a blacksmith or somebody.
Is that Simon? Is that his name?
Well, Simon was, Samson was the other, right? Maybe it was Simon.
I think it might be.
It seemed like
Simon.
there was somebody else that did that. So my point would be that Elizabeth George Speare likes to write a certain style of book. So even if I forgot her name or hadn't heard it before, and I read any of those 3 books, the odds are good I'd go, I think I know who this author is. Just like if we hear a piece of music or if we see a piece of art. And I think that's a sign of really learning to love literature, is looking for the author's voice and then being surprised when you find it again.
Yeah. It was actually Simon that was the blacksmith. I just looked it up just to be sure I wasn't being crazy too. And one of the things that he does is he gives Daniel a job so that he can become a man and earn money to care for Leah. And that mentor figure is really important in most of these coming of age novels. That, as you said, they're not simply left to their own devices. They do have mentors. The mentors aren't always their parents. They do have a mentor who ushers them into adulthood.
Yeah. So if you look at YA novels today, like I haven't read any, so the only one I could even refer to would be Twilight series, because I saw a couple of those. The people who help the children are other children.
Yeah.
Not adults. There may be some adult characters, but they certainly are usually either the bad guys or the neglectful parent, or, somebody that's not particularly helpful to them.
Yeah.
So we're trying in classical conversations, have our children read literature that doesn't say that, or have that message.
Yeah.
And we love our kids to have friends and peers to help them, but we're here too.
And I think that's true. And it's a good word for us as parents too, because when I was a younger mom starting out in homeschooling, I had friends, and that was really important. But I also had mentors who had children far older than my children. And that was the most important, because I needed mentors who could see further down the road than I could, just like these children do. So at every stage of life, you need mentors like that.
Yeah, I would say that's really good. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Julie.
No, I was going to say, go ahead, Tim. He's raising his hand
Oh,
so politely.
Go, Tim.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because our culture really leans into independence and sort of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. And while there's a lot of good in that, it also tends to drive people away from looking for mentors, because it looks like you're weak or ignorant, and you are. But it's a good thing to acknowledge that and seek out someone who can help you, and to do that in front of our children, to show them that that's the right way to learn and grow is a good thing.
Yeah, and just circling back to our comment about whiffery, I think that was an important part of both husbandry and whiffery, is that because those roles were clear, they could pass down their wisdom. And so I was grateful as a young mom also to have my grandmothers around, because they had a lot of wisdom to impart to me, and they were calmer than I was as a young, anxious mom. And all those things were important as they were teaching me whiffery. So anyway.
Yeah, I was a new Christian as a new mom. And I think one of the things that was just the best was, I could think of 3 different women when I was 23-ish and had 2 babies, came to me separately and said, could I mentor you? I mean, how wonderful that was, right? So we've had that experience. So if someone isn't interested in mentoring you, go find somebody that's interested in that. They're there, and I wonder if communication is getting to the point where people would feel like they couldn't ask that anymore. Okay, so before we actually, let's see, we still have about 10 minutes left. So Jennifer, you were going to read a portion for us to discuss. Do you want to do that now?
Yeah. So this is we've talked a lot about how Daniel is trying to originally seek revenge against the Romans who crucified his father. And this is a scene between him and Jesus when, again, Daniel's deciding who to follow. And Jesus says, Daniel, I would have you follow me. And he says, Master, I will fight for you to the end. My loyal friend, Jesus said, I would ask something much harder than that. Would you love for me to the end? I don't understand, he said again. You tell people about the kingdom. Are we not to fight for it? And Jesus says, the kingdom is only bought at a great price. There was one who came just yesterday and wanted to follow me. He was very rich. And when I asked him to give up his wealth, he went away. And Daniel says, I'll give you everything I have. And he says, riches are not keeping you from the kingdom. You must give up your hate. I thought that's my favorite scene in the book.
Yeah. Does anybody else want to comment on that?
So I pulled a question to help spark us from
Okay.
the Words Aptly Spoken children's literature, because it occurred to me I haven't pulled that out in a little bit, and I thought I'd pull it out. And one of the questions was, can freedom ever come from vengeance and hate? And I thought that was a good tie into this quotation we just read about him giving up his hate. So I was trying to think, I could only come up with one situation where freedom actually came not from hate, but from anger. And that's Jesus's righteous anger when he overturns the moneylenders' tables. He did free the people from their cheating in that act. I don't know if we would call that vengeance, but it's certainly righteous anger.
Yeah, it's really hard for us to be angry well. Like that. Well, what makes me think about is, because I'm always so politically minded, how the world's just so angry and revengeful and hateful over all the stuff that's happening in the schools. And yet we know that, we have said this so many times, if you try to get rid of a demon, but you have nothing to replace it, more demons come. And that's exactly what we're seeing. And so everybody's so angry about it that they can't stop and say, wait a minute, what's that loving good thing we can offer instead? So that's something that my family, and they're all grown, that we talk about an awful lot, that it's the goodness of God that woos men unto him. So I think Jesus was referring to that when he was contrasting that hate that's in Daniel's heart with, could you do something to love him?
Yeah.
Well, and isn't there a verse that says you cannot have hate and love? What is that verse? You cannot love or hate your neighbor or hate something and love something else. Like it is an either or. And I think, as Jesus did, Daniel reminds me of Peter. I think Peter, he cut the ear off, of the, that this idea of fighting, and even fighting for our freedoms in this country. We have freedoms. We have people who are fighting. And this other question you have, is freedom a natural right? Is it something, freedom from what? And I think Jesus was always so good to look under this deeper. Okay, you might think you need freedom from this, but this is actually the issue. It's your hate, or it's your greed, or it's, your love of money, or whatever it is. There's a deeper, a deeper place that he wants us to look. It's the surface level freedom. That might bring joy for a minute, or freedom for a minute, but it's what if we could never leave our homes again and homeschool our children, or what if that were to happen, that we still can have freedom, just because the surface level freedom has been taken away. So I love he does this, here with Daniel. He did it with Peter, calls him out.
I think that's good what you touched on, Julie, that idea of the surface level, because we do long for physical freedom, and that's what the zealots are longing for. They're longing for physical freedom in the here and now, and that's not a bad thing. But there's also the spiritual freedom, just as you said. If our bodies were locked up, there's still spiritual freedom, as long as we don't become enslaved to our sin.
Yeah. It's hard to feel free in that situation, though, if you're afraid to die.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. So,
yeah.
So we can feel abandoned when really love is right there. We'll just, look for it. Okay, so you had a theme that you were going to share with us.
Yeah,
Jennifer?
so we've talked and we're kind of dancing all around it, aren't we? So there's this constant contrast in the book between freedom and captivity. So Daniel is a captive to the person he's apprenticed to, because his grandmother has actually sold him into that apprenticeship. It's not like a job. This is hard for us sometimes as Americans to think about being sold to someone else for labor. Then we talked about Joel being imprisoned, and we've talked about Leah's really in prison. She's
prison
in captivity. She's in prison of her mind. And then Samson is a captive and Joel is arrested. So everyone has this experience of captivity in the book. So that contrast between freedom and captivity keeps coming up. And so one of the questions in Words Aptly Spoken is, when Daniel runs away, what gives him the right to do that? And what authority would you use to justify your answer? I thought those were good.
Yeah, that's tough, because you would think that all slaves should run away and get rid of, not be under oppression. But the scriptures say, to again, try to woo your master. And of course, slavery is culturally really difficult. Nobody wants to do that. But, we had indentured servants in the United States where people sold themselves into slavery. So this is more like that kind of a situation where he wasn't being beaten. He just had to work. He's being cared for and being taught a skill. And it was just a way of poor people rising back then. It's not necessarily the best way, but it was a way. And so I don't remember, I didn't read that section of it when I was reviewing for this. So I don't really know how to answer it in Daniel's context, but I would know in my context, I would certainly try to get away.
Yeah.
So I wonder if they think of it differently, though, because how many people hate their jobs but won't get away from them? They don't look at the choices they've made as enslaving themselves.
Right, which we would also think about with our spiritual enslavements, right? We don't always long to be free from those things that are snaring us.
Was he also being disobedient and maybe even dishonoring to his family, to his grandmother, by running away from the situation that she had arranged for him? I think
because she might have owed money if he ran away.
Yeah, and as a young person, we often are very self-absorbed, right? It's about my situation and what I'm experiencing, and we tend to not look at how our decisions might impact other people.
Yeah, that's the thing about these books that we read, is there are difficult questions like that, right? You want to say run, and it gives you a chance to say to the kids, well, maybe there's some other circumstances that we're not used to thinking about. That doesn't mean we want bad things to ever happen to anybody, but we also can try to understand the historical context as well as the community's context and what's going on in the story.
Yeah.
So it reminds me of how many people, Jennifer and I talk about this a lot, how many people don't like Taming the Shrew because they don't understand what slapstick witty comedy is, because they didn't watch enough Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn movies to know that it's just, it sounds like to the modern ear who has no historical context that Petruchio is super mean to Kate. But if you watch any kind of black and white movies from the 40s, 50s, that's the kind of banter they had. It was a way for the sexes to compete with each other and to have conflict and to have a dialogue on the stage. So you gotta, we're not used to that anymore.
Yeah, I was thinking this maybe, I'm trying to weave a lot of different thoughts together. This so often happens when we're thinking about one idea that you keep seeing it everywhere in your life. So I've been listening to a Bible in a Year podcast, and this morning it was in Numbers and was talking about when the Israelites conquered another nation, a man could take a woman to be his wife. And it was interesting to think about that she wasn't to be a slave. So this is, but it is a feels like a captivity to her, right? So he's allowed to take her in, but he had to let her grieve her old way of life for a month before he could do anything. And then he had certain obligations where if it didn't work out for them, he could divorce her, but not sell her. And so it was interesting to me again here to think about this idea of freedom and captivity seems to be chasing me this week.
Yeah. Okay, so we only have we're out of time. Does anybody have some closing thoughts here?
I need to hear the last sentence of the book.
Oh yeah,
No!
you said, oh, you can't read it. It's a spoiler.
It's a spoiler. I can't. It's so good.
Okay,
Yep.
I'll have Lauren read it to me. I'll call her when I get off.
Okay, good.
No,
Yeah.
that means everybody go read it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, read it aloud to your family next
Mhm.
month for Easter week. And another one that that's a holiday book we like a lot here in CC is to read The Best Christmas Pageant Ever out loud at Christmas season. So with that, thank you so much for being here. I enjoyed the conversation with you guys, and let's see you next week. Bye.
That was great. Bye, guys.